Well, welcome back to another episode of the Always About People show. My name is Chris Allen. I'm the host of This Crazy Thing, and we're really excited about today's episode. I know that every week we try to bring you relevant content to your leadership, to the workplace, to how we care for and love people in our environment today. And so each week we try to bring examples and felt needs from the organizations that we're working with collectively and try to address the things that people are talking about, the issues and the challenges that leaders have. And one thing that has continued to come up recently is just the need for additional clarity. And so today we thought we would bring back a previous guest, Rick Hasty, who is a certified executive coach and joined me for a prior episode. Those of you who watch this show regularly, you'll remember the episode 4 Powerful Principles for Every Leader, where we talked through these 4 concepts of care and clarity and learning and accountability. And Rick and I went back and forth on what it is that we need to see in leaders today. And so we thought we would bring Rick back to cover one of those specifically, being clarity. I think most of what we hear from organizations and from individuals is, I was hired. I'm pretty clear on what I do, but honestly, I think I'm doing the right thing. I think I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. I don't really know if I'm winning every day, but I think I am. And then from leaders, we have, I'm not really sure why they're doing that, or I'm not really sure why they're prioritizing that with their time. And what we're beginning to see is just a lack of clarity between the two. So Rick and I are going to cover this. We're going to do our best to leave you with some really practical insights on how you can establish greater clarity, which ultimately builds trust. And so would you help me welcome Rick Hasty back to the show? Rick?
Hi, Chris.
It's good to have you.
Well, it's great to be back with you again. Thank you for having me back.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to just jump into this conversation. And as you and I went back and forth and even thought through the direction of this conversation and how we could best give people practical insights, so much of your thoughts around clarity are this idea of communication. And that communication is really what leads to clarity. I think some of what we were talking about is that in a book, The 4 Disciplines of Execution, they talk about this lack of clarity organizationally, and that 1 in 7 people could name even one of their organization's most important goals. Only 15%. 51% were passionate about the goal. 81% of people said they were not held accountable. And 87% of people had no clear idea what they should be doing to achieve the goal. In other words, we have no idea what we're supposed to be doing. We lack clarity. Rick, what's the problem?
Well, Chris, those statistics would often make you think that the problem is at the top of the organization, that the way that the organizational leader communicates the vision of the firm, or who their customers are, or what their key objectives are. You could easily come to, I think, a wrong conclusion that the problem is at the very top in the way that they communicate those particular items. But I would maybe challenge that thinking a little bit as it relates to, certainly there needs to be clarity at the top, that it certainly starts with a good vision, a good way of communicating to both the firm and to the outside customers, oftentimes, of where they're headed, who are their target customers, what product do they really have to sell, and what are their values as an organization. And so those things are very important, certainly, for the leader of an organization to communicate. But if it doesn't go further down from there, then the people throughout the organization really begin to certainly lose maybe the sight to what the firm is all about, but they, even more important, lose how it's relevant to them personally.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think the disconnect is most often found.
No, that's good. So even when we think of it across workplaces, there may be a clear vision, there may be a clear mission, a purpose.
Right.
There are values in place. Look, they're on the wall. Um, People can repeat them, people can talk about them, but unless that clarity goes down deeper, we might still have confusion.
Yeah, a poster on the wall is great to reinforce some of those messages, but unless an individual personally understands how they can integrate the things they do every day into those goals and objectives and into that future vision, if they can't see themselves within that vision in the future, then they begin to lose interest. And I would suggest perhaps with some of those statistics, it's not that they don't know what the objectives are, but they just don't mean anything to them, and
Yeah.
therefore, in a quick question, they don't even remember what they are.
That's right. Yeah, it doesn't go any further. Hey, just a quick timeout to remind our guests who are watching, whether you're watching live on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, we would love it if you would send in questions, comments. We'd love to get to them even live on the show. And if you're watching this as a recording later, we will still want to encourage you, send in questions, comments. We'll address them as best we can. And so that was just a quick timeout. But I want to get back to this, Rick, this concept of how do we take this deeper down to the individual level where it's actually going to impact trust between people, motivation, performance, my ability as an individual to feel purpose in my work and see how my work connects with the greater vision of the organization. Where does that responsibility lie?
It lies throughout the organization. It doesn't lie with one person. One person might have some additional responsibility. For instance, corporate communications could have certain specific, broad communication responsibilities. Certainly, the CEO has the broad responsibility of painting the vision, or I would say making sure that vision gets painted for the whole organization. In other words, sometimes you may have CEOs or organizational leaders who are not great communicators, and they delegate that role, at least publicly, to someone else, and that's fine. They just have responsibility to see that a clear, distinctive, valuable, important, purposeful vision is delivered, again, both externally as well as internally. But then where their personal responsibility begins to take place is, let's say, at the organizational leader level, let's call it the CEO for a second, that they all have personal direct reports. They all have people, usually functional leaders, the head of finance or the head of sales or head of operations, head of supply chain, may all report directly to the CEO. So the question then is, how does that CEO, how does that organizational leader translate the vision of the organization to the very responsibilities that each of those individuals have? And so again, if he or she is not connecting those to the individual leader, then they are often confused about the goals and aspirations of the organization themselves. But let's just say that the leader does that well. Then at that point, they're passing off that responsibility to those functional leaders to then individually communicate with the people that report to them. What does all of this mean to you? How do your strengths, how do your personal aspirations align with the future of our organization? And so as that happens, and as people really begin to see that who they are, what they're best at, genuinely intersects with the goals and future of the organization, they begin to get excited. And as they see that being displayed, communicated in an honest, authentic way, they don't just build trust with the company, they build trust with the people around them, and they
Mm.
begin to communicate in similar ways.
Yeah. So I feel like I've heard leaders say this before, but why is it my responsibility as a leader to connect all the dots for people? Shouldn't it be just their responsibility to connect their own personal performance with the vision, mission, purpose of the organization? Why do I as a leader have to step in there and help connect the dots?
It's funny that that's not an unusual question. I think, at least in the back of the mind of leaders, of organizational leaders at the very top. I remember having a conversation with a CEO one time who was a bit frustrated with the board that they reported to, because that board had not given them a job description. And
Mhm.
so I at first found that a little bit of an odd statement, but then my remark to them was, and this is what I've found, is that the higher up you go in an organization, the more it's expected of you to translate what I would consider ambiguity into clarity.
Hmm.
And so, I would say for CEO demand a job description is a little strange to me, but to demand a set of goals and objectives and a strategic direction from the board is very normal. It's their job to take that ambiguity that resides
Mhm.
in that and push it down into the organization. And again, I would say out into the marketplace. And so they're only going to give a certain amount of clarity, I would say, to their functional leaders. It's then the job of the functional leaders to take what ambiguity they have and push it down with more clarity to the next level.
Yeah.
At that point, it really, really is getting very personal. And I at least come back to our earlier discussion around the intersection between care and clarity. Because as you begin to communicate to individuals, it's extremely important that they see, first of all, that you do care about them, and then that you make the effort to communicate in a way that you bring clarity to them that demonstrates that you actually do care about them individually.
Hmm. Okay, so let's stop here for a second and let's help people really specifically, because what does it mean to communicate in a way of caring? Um, I, I think as I think about this, once we're cascading communication down from the direct reports into the CEO, we now have, let's just broadly term that group middle management.
Right.
Most of those middle managers were individual contributors. They were in a role where they were just doing a job well for their organization, and they've now been promoted. Now they're in middle management, and they now have a responsibility of not just doing a role, but now communicating with clarity to whomever is underneath their leadership. How do we actually communicate with care? Like, can you give us some practical handles on that?
Well, I can, and I can at least share the framework of a tool I've used in the past and found to be extremely effective. I would start with one problem, and that is that very seldom do I think we see good job descriptions. Often a job description is very vague in terms of what it's actually asking a person to do. And so I would say one caring thing is to be very clear with people that report to you exactly what your expectations are of them in their job role. What I've found, and I use some terminology that can be a little confusing sometimes, but that the term accountable is very valuable. And what I mean by that is I would like to tell someone that reports to me exactly what they are accountable for. What I mean by that is that this is if they don't do this, it won't get done. That they and they alone are responsible for this very specific job action or
Mm.
activity. And so it's certainly reasonable that they're going to do other things, be involved with other people that are accountable for other things, but perhaps they need my advice or they need to know information from something I've been working on. And so I'd say they have a responsibility to interact with other people, to give them information, to maybe participate because of certain ways that I happen to be skilled. But I first and foremost want them to be clear about what they are going to be held accountable for. And
Hmm.
if they don't do it, it won't get done. Or I might say it shouldn't get done. And
Well,
then I want them to know what other things they are involved in that someone else is accountable for. And then the third thing I think is very important for them to know is what authority they have. I think very often we keep authority as ambiguous and we don't let people know what decisions they are capable of making. And so therefore they keep pushing decisions back, moving it around, waiting for meetings, asking permission over and over again. And certainly there are some cases in which they should do that. But within everyone's job, especially you talked about middle management, at that level, there should be clarity in terms of what decisions can they make
hmm.
and what decisions are maybe too high for their pay grade.
All right. As a recap, better job descriptions that, and this is just sort of a side note, but I think in most organizations there is a template job description, and 90% of everyone's job description looks just about the same. And
Very often.
so to be clear, a good job description will clarify three things. The first that you mentioned is what you are accountable for. What is the thing that if you don't do this, or the things that if you don't do these, they won't get done? And probably for most mid-level managers, they might think, gosh, that's a little complicated, because the way that we hire people around here, Rick, is when there's something that just is too much to get done for the people that we have, we just hire somebody else, and all
Right,
of them are accountable for those things.
right,
And so clarity around what you're accountable for, then clarity around what you're supposed to be either involved in or participate in that someone else might be accountable for. And then
right.
the third, what authority levels do you have? Any further thoughts on that?
Well, I will say there the last item that I would say is an absolute must is certainly understanding what goals and objectives your manager has for you in the coming year. But all of those things I find are if they exist at all, then they tend to exist only in my drawer. And I think it's a mistake also that I'm the only one on my team that knows my job description. Um, because what you mentioned before is that in a, let's say, a very responsible environment, I just get done whatever needs to get done. Well, that sounds good. But if everyone here has accountable actions that they are responsible for and they do their job, that frees me up to do the things that I'm accountable for and to do them the very best they can be done.
Yeah.
In a great environment, actually, what I'm accountable for is going to be aligned with what I'm best at. And
Hmm.
so I shouldn't be distracted doing things that I'm not best at because they're just not getting done by other people. So if I know what I'm accountable for and I know what my teammates are accountable for, then I get to focus on what I know I'm responsible for and what I'm going to get measured on. And again, hopefully it aligns with what I'm best at, and others will perform the same way. That
Hmm.
creates a lot of trust across the organization and a lot of productivity.
Yeah. Well, that just reminded me, a topic that we've covered on a previous show, Rick, is this idea of social loafing. And that in a team of people, if people aren't clear on specifically what they are accountable for, and everybody just believes that they're participating in some group goal, you'll begin to see certain people reduce their efforts. And it has less to do with motivation and more to do with the fact that, like, I just believe someone else has it. The real practical example of that is when you get CC'd on an email and you notice that there's 25 other people CC'd on the email.
Right.
Who's actually responsible for responding? Most of those 25 people will all look and think like, well, somebody else is going to respond. And so I think that what that does is, like, if I'm not clear on what I, Chris Allen, am accountable for, and I'm just participating with a team, it leaves it open not only for confusion, but for social loafing as well. We're not getting the best out of people.
Yes, and I think that in that scenario you just painted there, which is all too common, the reality is as I've certainly said plenty of times before, if more than one person is responsible, then nobody's responsible, and that's what tends to happen when this clarity doesn't exist. That really there's lots of things that need to get done that actually nobody is responsible for. And so that's the other thing that happens when you put all of these job descriptions together and you can look across the spectrum. You see where items are missing. And oftentimes you can look at that and go, well, no wonder that's not getting done or it's not getting done well, because actually there's nobody that's responsible. The two ways you see that is either an item's missing or you have several people that believe they're accountable for the same thing. So
Yeah.
when this is done well, you're able to delineate between job roles, and you see that there are specific responsibilities assigned out across the team.
Yeah. All right, let's jump back into this idea of creating clarity at the individual personal level.
Mhm.
And really, it's caring for the person enough to
That's
create
right.
this clarity. We're going to help them understand what they're accountable for, what they should be involved in, what authority levels they have, and then also outlining goals and objectives. How can we have these clarifying conversations with people? I mean, like, what should that look like? Where should it happen? Um, should it happen in a group? Just maybe give some specifics.
Well, certainly an easy place to start, but I would say not by any means the only place to start is before you hire someone, is to have real clarity around what it is you expect of them, and what their goals and objectives are, and of course, again, what's your authority? And then when you have it clear in your own mind, it's much easier to share it with someone else. It's much easier to pick the right person. And I do think that you could say caring for an individual on an individual level really starts with assigning them to a role, hiring them, for instance, for a role that they're actually capable of doing.
Hmm.
And so, if you can align the job role and responsibilities along with someone's greatest strengths, now you have a tremendous opportunity to overproduce. And when someone overproduces, now you're setting them up for future promotion.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Well, all of this, it creates a little bit of an issue because now that we've got people working in remote environments, we're having to communicate a little bit differently. We're communicating over screens. We're communicating on the phone audibly. We're like, communication just gets a little bit more complicated. You have to be a little more intentional about it.
That's right.
What are you seeing across maybe the global workforce, and how can we continue to create clarity through communication even in this remote work environment?
Well, let's certainly start with the positive, which is our ability today to communicate visually across huge ponds like the Atlantic and the Pacific is tremendous. I mean, I've certainly been able to talk to people. I was on a phone call last night with Singapore, and it just as might as well have been you.
Yeah.
And let's say at some level we might as well have been sitting in the same room. And that's fantastic. It really is. And it's a much better way to communicate than some of us would remember gargly lines and getting cut off in phone calls with folks, particularly outside of the country. But the reality too is that Zoom calls, just to use one of our options, uh, are not perfect substitutes for face-to-face communication.
Hmm.
And so I think even though there's value and productivity that comes from a remote communication, whether it be visually or whether it just be audibly, then you've really got to find time to be in person sometime. And the more, probably the better. Maybe it doesn't have to be 100%. In fact, I'm sure it doesn't. I personally don't like to go into the office any more than I need to, really. And I do appreciate the commute time from my house to my office, which is a solid 3 to 4 seconds. Um,
Yep.
I'd love for it to stay that way, but I also know and I've found that being face to face matters. You get in conversations you'll never get into over a Zoom call. Uh, there's an interesting statistic research that's been done during the pandemic, Chris, that actually shows that we communicate better when we're communicating this way. It is better audibly than it is even using a screen. In
Hmm.
other words, when we're just talking over the phone, we're actually listening better than when we're using a visible method like Zoom. It's an interesting bit of research, and I don't think all the answers have been found as to why that's true, but I suspect it's just we've been talking over the phone for years and years. We've learned how to listen for clues, listen to tone of voice, listen for what people are saying, and actually um, um, processing that communication intuitively in a very effective way. I think we're still learning to do that via screenshots.
Well, that's really fascinating. I think we're going to have to save this conversation for another time because it just triggered a thought in my mind of some of the complaints with the younger generation in that they don't
Mm.
even like to talk on the phone. It's text, it's email.
Right.
And in text to email, you lose all tone of voice, you lose all nonverbal communication. At least phone, you get tone of voice, changes of inflection, etc. Then you add video and you get some of the facial expressions, nonverbals, etc. But what we were talking about before is that it also brings about distraction. And so
Right.
there may be people who are literally watching this show right now or a replay who are multitasking as they're listening to us. They're answering emails, checking things. And that can't be great for concentration.
Right.
So again, it's just finding these ways to really care for people, but caring in a way that creates the clarity they need to perform even better, to be motivated to perform better.
Yes, and I think we have to admit that the evidence is overwhelming that social media does not promote good relationships and does not promote good communication. And so while it's great in terms of its speed and accessibility, it's not necessarily great in terms of its effectiveness.
Yeah, that's great. So coming back to the title of our show, clarity builds trust.
Right.
Clarity builds trust because as we're creating clarity through communication and we're doing it in a personal way, we're making a personal connection with somebody. There's a psychological concept called mirroring, which
Mhm.
is in relationship with somebody. When you're sitting face to face with somebody within proximity, they've actually found that your heart rates will begin to beat in sync. After about 15 minutes, people's facial expressions will begin to mirror one another. Their
Right.
nonverbal communication, their crossed arms, their hands on their chin. And by the way, you can look at this next time you're in a restaurant. But this concept of mirroring brings about trust between two people. So if we're really trying to create clarity, we have to do it through communication. Communication needs to be done person to person. And if we can do that right, we're actually increasing trust. Is that how you see it?
I do. But I would say that that doesn't tend to happen on screens. And so I think your point there, which I totally agree with, is that if you really want to connect with somebody, you've really got to do it in person. And certainly we can, let's say, discount the level of connection that we make by doing it over Zoom. I could not be in Singapore last night and here today. But I could have a good conversation and did have a great conversation. But I also have to recognize that it's not really building the kind of relationship that would be best for certainly friends and coworkers over time.
That's great. All right, let me do a recap, and I'll give you one more chance to tie a bow on this. So when we think about creating clarity, there's obviously corporate clarity that's happening at an organizational level. And that is passed down, and it's cascaded through an organization, but it's got to reach every level. Right. And most of that's happening through this middle level of management. And really what we would say is we need leaders to understand their role in creating clarity, and that the best way to do it is to do it face to face, to do it in person. And you've given us 4 really practical things that need to be included in creating clarity. Number 1, helping people understand what they're accountable for. Number 2, helping them understand what they're involved in, but someone else may be accountable for. Number 3, what is their level of authority? What do they have authority over? And number 4, laying out goals, objectives for the quarter, for the year, whatever time period. But the best way to do that, in person where trust can be established. And in the remote work environment, sometimes that's difficult. So as a recap to this idea of clarity building trust, Rick, I just want to give you a minute or so to just anything else you want to add to the conversation.
Well, I think you've summed it up really well. Though I would just remind you that those 4 things fall under the umbrella of care and clarity. So those are items that are bringing clarity to an individual. But when they're done with care, in other words, you're really thinking about what those individuals' strengths and weaknesses are and how they fit into that job role description. And you're caring in terms of how you communicate these items to them in ways that they clearly understand, and you're willing to listen to them and see how these fit with what they see in their abilities. Now you're combining those 2 umbrella items of care and clarity, and now you're going to equip the person that works for you to be at their very best.
That's awesome. Well, the purpose of Always About People is to help create cultures where people can thrive, where they can be the best versions of themselves. And so if creating clarity can actually bring about that sort of productivity through the flourishing of individuals, the thriving of individuals, that's what we're all about. So I just want to say thank you. Thanks for conversation number 2. Man, we've got so many more. We need to continue this, Rick. Maybe we just come on and cover all kinds of topics. But thank you again, Rick. Appreciate it. Those of you who watch every week, thank you for joining us. Again, you can catch us live on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on YouTube, and you can go back and you can watch all the previous episodes. We would love for you to just like, subscribe, join, get notifications, whatever. That's the world we live in today, but we appreciate you joining us. Hope you found it practical and useful. We'll see you next time.